Hi everyone, please consider subscribing. It's really good for the channel and it's completely free. Thank you. So in this video, I'm continuing to address the theme of looking at, in quotes, why is this happening, meaning the rather turbulent times we're living through. And here I'm going to look at Saturn cycles going back a long time, about a century or so, to see reflections of what was happening at different times and how it correlates to what we're seeing today. And on that note, I will also say that I'm not looking at any notes at the moment. I'm just looking at the camera and I'm talking, so it's all from my own memory of the history of the times, together with the astrological positions at different points. So I'll ask you to be patient with me if I may have to pause here and there to perhaps remember more clearly, or not, we'll see. And in terms of the planet Saturn, here I'm looking at Saturn in relationship to the US chart, because the US chart has multiple planets in cardinal signs. Cardinal signs are Aries, Libra, Cancer, Capricorn. The US is a Cancer country with Venus and Jupiter conjunct in Cancer. Mercury is also in Cancer. And then Saturn itself is in Libra, squaring the American sun. And then we have planets in Capricorn, namely Eris and Pluto. So overall, you're looking at 2 plus 3 plus 4, 7 out of 11 points. It's a lot of planets in cardinal energy. This actually is really good because it suggests a nation that's very driven, takes action, influential. Cardinality tends to be that way. Thing is, though, Saturn, if you say as a broad energy, it tends to be difficult, hard. Indeed, anything hard in life. Ice, rocks, is Saturnian, and hard meaning difficult as well. And because it's a reducing, limiting, contracting effect, which on the high end is great for work and focus, and indeed that's the top of the heap for Saturn. But nevertheless, it is a reducing energy and correlates perfectly with the idea of economy and economies, because that's what economies are. That's what they represent. It's the idea of getting your affairs in order and doing as much as you can within a limited amount of resources. Otherwise, it would be a free-for-all and you could just spend free to do whatever you like. Well, Saturn represents that which says to you, stay in your lane, hold it together, and often will correlate with reduction, with doing with less, and so on. And so you would then expect that if you look at historical patterns, you might find that kind of thing. And that's in fact what is there. That's what I found when I looked at the history. Though I will say it's not always economic directly. Sometimes it's just a plain difficult period where the country is traversing challenging circumstances. And so I'll start by going back about 100 years. Saturn in Capricorn enters there in 29, just in time to reflect that horrible crash, which leads to a really tough period that eventually produces the Great Depression. So 29, 30, in that range, that's when Saturn is in Capricorn. Then fast forward from there a little bit, and you go into the 37 to 39 period. That's the next cardinal sign, Saturn in Aries. that period was when, as a result of the Nazi influence in Europe and the rise of fascism during the 1930s, which separately also has a lot to do with Pluto, but we'll cover that in a different video. Main point is Saturn there in Aries correlated with this influence really infiltrating America, so that Nazis were, doing the equivalent of town halls, demonstrations. I mean, in some ways similar to what we're seeing today for entirely different reasons, but this was a real problem by that part of those years of the Roosevelt administration, which was very progressive. But this is what happens to what happens is that if you bring in a government that tilts to the left or center left, meaning bringing more resources to more people, business people, right-wing thinkers, tend to get more and more irritated, and they start to side with those impulses. But of course, it was horribly evil, and it was growing, and it was becoming a real problem during that Saturn and Aries period of the late 30s, which then leads to the mid 1940s, the height of the war, including the atomic bomb, and then of course the end of the war as well. That was Saturn in Cancer, another period which was very difficult for the country, when people were not at ease, obviously, because of how tough the situation was. Then we go fast forward a little more, we go into the Saturn and Libra period of the early 1950s. There you've got all the paranoia, the McCarthyism, everyone's a communist, and we got to expose them. And it took until Saturn got out of the Libra zone for that to essentially be stopped, and the country moved in a different direction. That was uncomfortable for that reason. It was not an easy period at all. Then we go to 1960, actually 59, 60, 61. That's Saturn in Capricorn. And at first I thought, well, that was great, because that was John F. Kennedy's elected. There was quite a bit of optimism and so forth. But upon looking it up, the country experienced a recession as well, a period of low economic activity. And that's what you tend to notice quite frequently with Saturn, because Saturn's nature, as I say, is to bring about that kind of reduction. And then if we go another few years to the next Saturn sign, cardinal sign, that's Aries, that's the late 60s, 67 to 69. These were really tough times. The country was in, tremendously opposed to the Vietnam War, with demonstrations on the streets. It was very, very turbulent, not easy years at all. And that, by the way, that's another Saturn in Aries. And I made a bit of a pattern in that you backtrack to the previous Saturn in Aries, you're in that, Nazi rising influence in the news, and trying to convince people to join those movements, including, by the way, Henry Ford, who was a car manufacturer. He was sympathizing with those people. Lindbergh as well. That's been back in the 1930s. And in the 60s, again, you get a period that is pretty challenging for the U.S. And then if you go forward from there into the mid-70s with Saturn in Cancer, well, that's the crash and burn of Richard Nixon, Watergate. Also, the country had left Vietnam with its tail between its legs. It was really not an up period for the U.S. at all. It was very difficult, that period. Then you go forward to the 80, really more like 81, but late 80, definitely the incoming Reagan administration. Those early years were economically very tough, because there had been an energy crisis, and inflation was high, and then interest rates rose to really high levels. And it took until Saturn got further in, left Libra, went into Scorpio in 83, 84, when things stabilized. So that the period of the early Reagan years economically was quite hard. I mean, separately, it was also the height of the Cold War, though that continued throughout the 80s. But just to point out that Saturn in cardinal signs stresses the American chart, because when it's in a cardinal sign, it'll square and oppose everything that is there in the natal chart. Then from there we go to Saturn in Capricorn, which is at the end of the decade. Now there, although I won't talk about it too much here, the saving grace was that Uranus at the time was also in Capricorn. It was also through a separate movement in astrology, which relates to declination and being out of bounds. It was a really powerful moment in the sense of promoting democracy, hence the fall of the Soviet Union, and it led to a period when democracies were really ascendant, really being supported and promoted and so forth. But the thing is, that period also featured an economic downturn, which in fact was what caused George H.W. Bush's loss in large measure to Bill Clinton, because he had transacted the war in Iraq, the first war, the conflict over Kuwait. He had done it really well in a measured way, and normally that would have ensured his re-election. Well, it didn't. And the main reason it didn't work is because of the economy, which, if you recall, at the time, Ross Perot was on the scene talking constantly about the economics of things. And indeed, Bill Clinton's famous message, "It's the economy, stupid." This was the key around that time. And so the point is, there was a period of recession during the Saturn and Capricorn period. Now, the next one is the one that is the most puzzling, that doesn't give me anything to really grab onto unless I focus on the fact that in 96, 97, 98, that period was actually totally fine economically, pardon me. But there was the Monica Lewinsky scandal, which at the time tarnished the presidency. But quite honestly, the only way I can account for that Saturn in Aries of all these periods across a century, because that's the one that seems relatively easy. The one thing that I would say, though, is that sometimes what happens with any planet is that what is going on at the time can become a problem later as well. Even though, like in all the other ones so far, there's clear evidence right there that something is happening. In the 96, 97, 98, my feeling is that this is what led to the dot-com bubble burst. There was the internet had just started in the mid-90s, and then there was this incredible enthusiasm that was completely misplaced. Companies were starting with, they'd have capital, and it was about having clicks, views, but no one was making any money. And so then predictably, it all crashed in a big way, but that happened later. Nevertheless, that's the one period of Saturn in Aries, ironically enough, because I mentioned two others that were quite hard. That one was pretty good. There was something else I saw as well, that the Jupiter-Uranus cycles were very favorable at the time, and that might have been the reason why it made the cycle easier. But regardless, that would be the outlier, so to speak. Then the next period of Saturn in Cancer, that's the U.S. in the thick of the Iraq War, which was a terrible idea, which led to all kinds of problems for the country later. And in general, if the country's at war and, scandals are erupting right and left, which there were, I remember at the time this was happening. So again, that period is difficult. That Cancer period is the 30-year mark from Watergate. Saturn has a 30-year cycle, so you go for over 30 years. And then the Saturn in Libra period, that's the 08 crisis, because that crisis happens with Saturn in Virgo, but right away in in 2009, late 2009, 2010, 2011. Saturn is in Libra, and the country is recovering from a terrible crash. And what I recall about that is that credit was really squelched, where prior to that point in the timeline, like I recall hearing a mortgage broker say that during the early years of the 2000s, the criteria for getting a mortgage was whether or not you had a heartbeat. There was zero examination, zero due diligence. They just were promoting all kinds of mortgages, which led to a huge problem. Point being, though, that those periods were again restricted. The whole idea is to realize the squelching energy of Saturn. In that case, it's very graphic. The economy was suffering, and it took quite a while for people to be able to get easy credit. I remember in those years, renegotiating your mortgage was really hard. They looked at all kinds of factors where before they were looking at none. Then we go forward another few years, and we get into Saturn in Capricorn, which is the last couple of years of Trump's first term, but probably most importantly, the COVID period. COVID period, strictly speaking, was Saturn in Aquarius, just a really, really early Aquarius. However, that year, the year of COVID, Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto were in Capricorn. And so it definitely fits. And it's a pretty obvious reduction in all kinds of things, reduction in space and economy, and it's difficult. It's hard on the country, plain and simple. Now, Saturn in Aries again. We're back to Saturn in Aries, which I don't think has much to do with what was happening in the late 90s. To me, it feels much more like the other Aries periods, like the one in the late 60s and the one in the late 30s, and how tough those periods were. The main point being that it squelches, it reduces the space. And now, of course, it's true that we all know now too that in large measure is being caused by a single person, because you introduce economic factors in the form of tariffs that cause the problem. But either way, we could say, to be blunt, it's not going to be a happy period. And this would be the case no matter who was there, for whatever reason. That's how astrology works. Now, what's the upside? The upside is that these are periods of adjustment, so that if we just continue to navigate, there's a chance for it to resolve itself. And, next sign comes along, the energy switches, and there's a sign after that. We're not going to see Saturn again now till after this, that is, after early 28. Saturn will be in Aries from pretty much now until now, meaning June, minus the fact that between October and the spring of 26, it goes back into Pisces, but then re-enters Aries and is there all the way till the spring of 2028. But after that, it doesn't return to a cardinal sign until the middle of the next decade. So, from the perspective of why is this happening, as I said at the beginning of this, it's a difficult period on that account. Now, if I can say something positive as well about the fact that, yes, the country adjusts and then you get to better times, this is what happens in an individual chart as well. This is why it's so important to know your own chart, know exactly what a planet like Saturn is doing. Here I'm doing, the just cardinal signs, and I'm saying this American chart has cardinal planets and so on. You can get very specific in a chart, and sometimes, for example, in the case of, say, Aries right now, you may not be an Aries or a Libra or a Capricorn or a Cancer, in which case the Saturn period we're going into wouldn't affect your sun. But Saturn can affect all kinds of other planets. And just knowing when the planet is somewhere and identifying the period that knowledge introduces a conscious knowing. You know it's there, and at minimum, you train yourself to wait it out, because if you do astrology long enough, you recognize that these cycles are very real. There's a palpable feeling, a palpable psychology that one experiences when Saturn's around. Of course, very often also mirrored through our outer life, what is going on in our life as well. But knowing the length of the period and waiting it out, that can often be enough to, lower the stress, because what people can get into a lot of trouble is situation is there and they can't see where it's going. They can't see daylight. They don't know how long it'll last. That's where astrology is really helpful, because you can pinpoint how long something will actually be. And then, of course, it's even more helpful if you learn more and more about the nature of Saturn and how to work with it while it's happening, because then it can become a really special period from the vantage point of working harder, tuning in, making more sacrifices. Saturn has this quality of, I do something today in order to make something much better later. That's one part of Saturn, where you could also say that it has an immediate effect. This is very ironic, because having said that, the idea that Saturn is sacrificed today in order to get something tomorrow, Saturn is also the ruler of time itself. Saturn is Chronos. And so if you think about it, the ultimate mastery of time is to so join with time that one lives in the moment in time, which both mystics and even scientists will tell you is really the only reality. We're always here. We're always now. It's just that our mind moves around, and memories from the past, anticipation of the future. The whole idea is to move the energy into the present moment. Once one does that, one is operating out of the highest level of Saturn. That, of course, now kills two birds with one stone, so to speak. Now it's no longer about what I do today will make things better for me tomorrow. It's actually what I'm doing today is making things better now and for tomorrow. Everything is being taken care of. So the planet can be worked with, but I will admit it's definitely a challenging energy. And I admit fully that I'll be in a Saturn cycle, and in one sense, at times I even enjoy the extra discipline. I can feel the growth. And yet I can also admit that there comes a point where I'm thinking, I'll be glad when this is over so I can move on to the next energy, so to speak. All right, I'll leave it there for now. But there are other movements, patterns in the planets, which I'll be describing, that are very, very useful in understanding the period that we're in and the types of outcomes that we are likely to see.